So welcome everyone. Like I said right before I hit record, our session is being recorded today for folks who couldn't make it. Our slides will be sent out today. And then, like I said, for those of us who are present, I'll do my best to monitor the chat for any questions. And then again, we're hoping to have a lively discussion today. So thanks for being here as part of our time together. So we're going to talk about avoiding interview bias from an employer perspective. So how you create your institutional recruitment team, how you talk about candidates, how you score them, how you assess who moves forward. Those are all different things we're going to talk about. We're also going to talk about the different types of interview bias that might come along and we might see in a student affairs job search. But before we even do that, formally, my name is Dr. Tim Layson. My pronouns are he and they. You're more than welcome to call me Tim or Dr. T, whatever you want. I currently serve as the TPE chair-elect and also the chair of our employer development. So I work with all of our employers through one-on-ones, emails, all that kind of good stuff. And so this is my third year on the Placement Exchange Steering Committee. And every year I've worked with employers, and now I am the chair in training for next year. So really excited to have colleagues here today with us. For the next 24 hours, I currently serve as an Associate Director of Residence Life at Santa Clara University. But come Monday, February 21st, 2022, I will start my new position as an Associate Director of Housing Operations at Northern Kentucky University. So excited for that. And again, our email is employers@theplacementexchange.org. Should you have questions, in the picture that you see is in honor of my last day here at Santa Clara. And so this picture was taken on the day our women's soccer team won the national championship. It was an exciting day. We actually got to do like a live-ish in person on a Jumbotron at the San Jose Quakes soccer field. So picture has a lot of meaning, but I figured I'd wear it on I figured I'd show it on my last day. So like I said, we're going to talk about why this topic is important. We're going to define interview bias. We're going to talk about the types of interview bias, how it shows up in our searching process, ways that we can avoid interview bias, some reminders, and what's next. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat or come off mute and ask them. I've also sprinkled in some thoughts from fellow colleagues in our field of how bias shows up in different ways within an interview process. So I want to own something before we even go forward. I am not a subject expert on avoiding interview bias. I have, just like everyone else, I have my own inherent biases because I am human. This presentation was put together from all the available resources that I could find from my own HR department to some online resources that I will also share with you all. I also had my presentation vetted with our university HR team to make sure that I'm hitting some of the points that they would also like to hit if they were here with me. Personal and professional experiences as a candidate and employer, I've definitely seen and heard of my own experiences and how people have felt like they were biased in an interview process. I will also share some other anecdotes that I've heard over the years. And again, there's feedback from our colleagues on the subject matter. And also just, I'm wanting to have this be a conversation between ourselves as colleagues. So essay colleague thoughts. So what I did is I emailed a few colleagues that I've worked with in a variety of settings in my own professional career. And I've also asked them to email some of their own folks who have gone through either TPE or their own interview process. And so I asked the very first question I asked is, why do we need to talk about interview bias? And so I'm curious, whether in the chat or coming off mute, like, why do we need to talk about this topic?
I would say I think it's important to kind of like how you did in the beginning of this presentation, acknowledge the fact that bias does exist because we are human. It's our human nature to have those implicit and sometimes explicit biases. So I think it's important for us, especially as employers, to talk about it so that candidates can see that one, again, acknowledging that we're human, we're still trying to make this the most equitable experience and inclusive experience for everyone involved. That goes for the candidates interviewing as well as for the employers.
Yeah, right on the head, Crystal. And so, in this first statement, it's important to recognize that interviews always hold bias, as it's human nature to do so, though they need to do whatever they can do to prevent themselves from acting upon such biases. And so, I think Crystal hit it right on the head with recognizing that we each hold our own biases, but also knowing that we have to talk about it so that way it doesn't sway our decision in any way. And the second one, it's a thing that occurs, it's a real thing that occurs, and awareness matters. Talking about it allows people to identify where it exists for themselves so that way they can account for it individually. Because at the end of the day, as an employer, you are a human being, and human beings are prone to making mistakes, having their own internal thought processes, and most importantly, owning a sense of bias. But the more that you can relate to it and call it for yourself, the better you can create that interview experience for that candidate. So we talk about why is this important for our employers. So we in our field right now, we are facing a hiring and retention of staff members, staff member challenges. And so we as a field have a hard time of being able to retain folks over the last couple of years. And obviously the pandemic has played into a good chunk of that. But we are experiencing a mass exodus of folks in our field. And so when we think about even just at the interview bias or interview process, the interview process begins the onboarding process. As soon as someone reads a position description on your website, your TPE posting, or maybe it was forwarded to them from another colleague, that begins the onboarding process because that allows a candidate to decide whether or not they believe the position will be right for them. Candidates are able to get a sense of your institutional culture, values, and norms. So I think that's really important, and how not only how you sell that, but how you also talk about it to candidates and each other, making sure that everyone's on the same page and naming the challenges together, talking about the challenges and how you all, as a department or institution or division, are overcoming some of those challenges. This helps with, we hear it from candidates all the time that the job I interviewed for is not the job that I'm actually doing. And obviously, knowing that folks may be doing double or triple duty, that is certainly the case right now. But even before this time, candidates were telling us, well, I interviewed with this school and I thought it was really great. And I thought I knew the job description, but then when I got there, it was a very different sense of reality. And so we definitely hear it from our candidates that the job that they interview for, the position they interview for, isn't the reality for them when they get there, which is also problematic. Excuse me. Talking about interview bias allows for reflection and introspection to clarify goals and objectives for hiring the individuals. It allows you to get on the same page with one another. If you're a recruiting team, or if it's just you and your supervisor, or just you and another person, it allows you to name call what the biases might be, and then come up with a game plan as to how you want to address them. So why does interview bias occur in the student affairs search? I'm curious to know, like, why does it happen? How does it happen? Feel free to use the chat or come off mute. All right, a few seconds has elapsed. I'm going to talk about a phrase that is sometimes often used when we're at TPE. It's the phrase of the candidate's energy seems really low. And so while on the surface, that may not be problematic, in the last couple of years, and even when I was an employer actively recruiting, I would say, like, how does that give any indication as to whether or not this person can do the job? And so part of the reason why, and I said it before, why interview bias exists in the student affairs search is it's actual people making actual assessments on other people. And I think that's important to remember. Like, it is another person assessing or judging another person against hopefully against a rubric or a set of standards that you all have come up with. There's also a lack of implicit bias training. And I'll share from my university what they do here at Santa Clara to kind of help with that in the hiring practices. But if you are working with a group of colleagues or training other folks on interviewing, one of the topics you'll want to make sure you get trained on is implicit bias and how that shows up in the interview process. Because while you may not think implicit bias is showing as an employer, candidates pick up on that very quickly. And they will tell other candidates as they go through the search process. Different people have varying definitions of experience. I have seen and personally been part of conversations where if you look at my resume, and I'm comfortable in disclosing this, if you look at my resume, there are they're not gaps, but you can see that I've spent a lot of time at different universities. And so my timeline is kind of all over the place a little bit. And I'm comfortable with that because there were reasons why I chose to leave at certain places. And I had an interviewer and I was the finalist for an AD level job at a university. And the interview group would have been my peer group. And one of my potential peers at the time asked and said, it looks like you may not have institutional loyalty, and the words were said, no institutional loyalty. You spent 2 years here, a month, 8 months here, a year, like 2 or 3 years there, and now you're coming here. What makes us think you're going to stay here? And I said, I understand the timeline of my resume, and that's why I'm comfortable in listing the dates. And I am more than happy to explain why I have chosen to make certain decisions at this point. And then I continue to say, but does that have any bearing on how I can do the job that I'm a finalist for? Because I'm pretty sure by you bringing me here in this final interview, it already demonstrates that I can do the job bullet points. And now we're trying to figure out like how I professionally click within this team. And needless to say, I was not offered that job. And I'm quite okay with it because if that was the environment that was already there, then it's probably not a place where I would have thrived. And so varying definitions of experience. Sometimes we look at personalities to fill positions versus if the person can fill the position based on the qualifications. Knowing that the field of higher education is the way that it is, sometimes people will say like, for orientation or any other positions like that, like you need someone who's high energy and all those things. And it's like, okay, but are we filling for a personality or the bullet points on the job description? Like, which is going to be more important? And so that's why interview bias definitely happens because we're looking to fill for a position, a personality for a position, and not the actual position itself. We don't know how to create effective, efficient, or unbiased questions. That is like the number one thing that we hear from employers around this topic is it's hard to create questions that aren't biased, and there are ways, excuse me, there are ways to do it. You also just have to work with your HR partners and all of those other folks. And then sometimes speculation is the standard of understanding a candidate's intentions. Even going back to this original statement of the candidate's energy seems really low. Okay, well, if a candidate has been interviewing all day and you're the fifth interview of their day, I would think my energy would be low just based on that. And sometimes employers will use that as a way to gauge whether or not this person is qualified. And that's not great. And that's not fair to that candidate. They can't help that the interview time schedule is the way that it is because that's how they were able to do it. So being able to use speculation, even in and of itself, is a form of bias. So here are some other thoughts. Another question is, and I'd like to know from you all, what is your definition of interview bias? All right, so I've asked colleagues, and this is what a colleague said. It's creating conditions during an interview process that advantages or disadvantages candidates based on their identity or characteristic that is unrelated to their ability to do the tasks associated with the job. Interview bias can be connected to things beyond interviews, like where you post a position, how you treat placement candidates versus HR candidates, having inconsistent interview questions, and teams not utilizing a rubric. These are all different forms of interview bias that can happen. And so if this sounds familiar to what you're doing or the process you're trying to create, it could be time to have your process internally reviewed to ensure that you aren't intentionally driving away candidates that could be really qualified for your position, but based on the way that it's either written or the way that it's advertised or where it's advertised, is not getting the candidate pool that you want. So looking for a little bit more official definition of interview bias, I use the digitalhrtech.com, and interview bias occurs when the interviewer judges a candidate not only on their skills and competencies, but on unspoken and sometimes unconscious criteria, hence making the interview less objective. As an employer, your job and our role is to be as objective as possible in being able to create a solid candidate profile for someone to want to come work for you. And so some other examples of interview bias that I've heard, the candidate didn't have a good gripped handshake, obviously pre-COVID, right? The candidate didn't make eye contact during the interview. Culturally, making eye contact with someone is also a sign of disrespect. Yes, Tony, letting your own implicit biases make judgments on a candidate, their interview, having judgment on things that are not related on how the candidate can perform the role. Totally great, and that's right on the head. And what some of these other sayings, like the candidate had their arms crossed the whole time, maybe they're cold, or maybe that's just how they naturally sit. That has no bearing as to whether or not someone can do a job. Because some people also say, well, they may not be as approachable. Okay, well, maybe they were cold, maybe that's what they want to do, maybe that's how they're most comfortable. You can't judge that. And that's certainly not a criteria on any job description, I would imagine. And if it is a criteria on a job description, let's talk about it, because that's highly problematic. Another one that we've heard from candidates, and other employers too, of the candidate Zoom background was really distracting. Okay, we're in this virtual world, and TPE is virtual, and just like myself, I have a virtual background that I'm using to like hide the mess of what my office looks like right now, because that is not necessarily pleasant. But that's something I own and that I can do, and I have the technology space to do it. Your typical candidate may not have that ability. So judging them by what their background looks like without knowing any context doesn't really speak to anything that they can do in the job. So it's really important to recognize what interview bias is and how it shows up. So, in what ways have you seen or potentially experienced interview bias? For anyone on our call or anyone on the Zoom right now, have you seen or heard of interview bias from anyone in your own personal experience?
I think one thing that came to mind just as you were talking last time with the bullet points when you talked about the personality versus the like experience, I hear people say a lot like, well, is this person going to fit in with our team or are they a good fit? But that's more towards their personality of whether they fit in with the colleagues around them. And honestly, it's good if they don't. Like, we need different perspectives and different personalities in the jobs. And so, like, whether or not they're a good fit with who is currently there shouldn't have bearing on whether or not they get a job.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Tony. And sometimes fit is used as coded language too. And that's it's also very highly problematic that people continue to use fit. And even in this presentation, the word fit is somewhere in there too, because it's also a bad habit that I'm trying to get rid of in my own vernacular of usage. And so, yeah, but Tony makes a great point. Like when folks sometimes say fit, it's like, oh, well, maybe they won't fit in because they don't seem as social. It's like that does not matter when you're making a final hiring decision. Like, yes, you want someone who can professionally get along with their colleagues and be good partners in collaboration with folks, but if someone who can do the job and isn't as social as some others, that's okay. As someone who is a hiring manager for my department, like I like yes, a person's energy is always going to be there, but it's our questions to me that make the difference as to whether or not I believe they can do the job, and how they're going to be able to professionally mesh with the things that they have to lead within their own residential community. So I asked this question, and this person said, it's hard to assess where I've experienced it because I don't know what I could know about it. It's inherently part of our process. Evaluators are expected to make judgment about someone's ability to successfully do a job based on a brief interaction that they may not be entirely objective. But educating on it, cultivating a process that dismantles it, and asking questions that focus on candidate experiences, problem-solving skills, and leadership philosophy can minimize bias. Yes. And those are all great points in a rubric that you can use to evaluate candidates. Because again, bias is inherently there because we're human. But I think it's important to really think through how that may show up for you as an employer and how you're creating the experience. There was a number of years ago at TPE, I think it might have been either the last on-site in 2019 or the one before it in 2018. But there was this is a story and something I heard while I was there volunteering, that a candidate who had a different name than what folks may have been accustomed to, or a name that is perceivably harder to pronounce or know, was not getting as many interviews as some of her other colleagues within her cohort. And she changed her name slightly to fit within a different way that folks can understand and read it, use the same resume, but just slightly modified their name. And she started getting more interviews. And that right there that's not just bias, that is just a straight up macroaggression in the interviewing. And mind you, this was at one of our most previous on-site experiences at TPE. So these things still happen, even in this age of understanding and knowing that interview bias exists and that we can talk through it. It still happens, even in that example. So we have to be really careful in how we evaluate people, and like evaluating someone on whether or not you can pronounce their name for a job that may be qualified to do is completely inappropriate, first and foremost, and is also extremely biased. Because that just doesn't show that you're an inclusive environment for everyone. So when we think about the types of interview bias, there is, if you've never heard of it, it's called SHRM, the Society of Human Resources Management. And so they define the 10 types of interview bias. So stereotyping, inconsistency in question, first impression, halo effect, horn effect, cultural noise, nonverbal bias, contrast effect, similar to me, or affinity, and central tendency. So I'm curious, have any of you on the call with us today, have any of you heard of these things, or is there one that you don't know what it is?
I don't think I've ever heard of the halo effect or the horn effect.
Yeah, so I can and I have my little cheat sheet that is also shared as a link. So the halo and horn effect are actually opposites of each other. So I'll read part of the definition. So halo effect is judging a candidate as strong in many areas because they are strong in one area. So let's just say I'm searching for a resident director here at Santa Clara University. And actually, we are looking for RDs if you want to know. And so one of our core attendant or one of our core job bullet points is conduct administration. So we look for folks who have either had prior conduct experience or something close to it. And if someone who has a really strong conduct experience that we see on their resume, we will assume that they are strong in every other category of the job because they have such strong conduct experience. And part of that also goes with conduct. You have to be administratively sound. You have to meet the deadlines. You have to make sure you know how to talk with students about policy violations and all those kinds of things. While that's great, and that touches on many aspects of the other job description bullet points, that does not make that candidate stand out than any other candidate. So the halo effect is just saying because they're really good at this one thing, that's going to make me assume that they're really good at everything else. Versus the horn effect, where a candidate is weak in many areas because they're weak in one area. So taking back, if we're looking at an RD candidate resume and they have no conduct experience, then we can assume that everything else on their resume may not be up to the same level because we're valuing the conduct experience more highly. And because this person doesn't have a direct oversight or direct experience within student conduct management, that means there are other areas they may also be deficient in from being a hall director. And so it's problematic. Either one is problematic, but halo and horn are very much the opposite of one another. So Tony, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there's some of these I've never heard of before. A big one is central tendency. And so central tendency is viewing all candidates as middle of the road. An example they give is holding such high standards that no candidate can meet them. So if you're finding that folks aren't applying to your positions as highly as you thought they would, it might be a good time to potentially review that position description. Are you writing it in such a way, or is it toned in such a way that that folks aren't literally going to be able to achieve all those bullet points, and therefore they don't see themselves within that particular role. So it's important to know these different types of interview biases, and horn and halo are definitely a good one. And one that is also very often we see is contrast effect, which is comparing candidates against others who came before. So candidate A just had so much better this versus candidate B. Well, yes, contrast and comparison is important to know who you'd want to move forward. Once you start comparing every other candidate to this one interview that you had, you're starting to creep into the lane of interview bias, because now you're not giving every candidate a fair opportunity to be evaluated individually. So you're asking, what are the common types that occur in student affairs? And it's all of them that you might be asking yourself, but they all do occur in some way, shape, or form. And so that's why it's important that we're having this topic, is to kind of be aware of it, because I've heard candidate stories over the years of my multiple years of volunteering at TPE and also being an employer and asking questions. Like, I have an example for each and every type of interview bias that I've seen or heard or experienced myself at one point. I mean, there was an institution when I was interviewing coming out of graduate school that, you know, I thought I was connecting with these interviewers at the interview table when I was doing TPE in person, and the interviews didn't really seem like into the interview or the conversation, and they kept looking past me to see what was happening. And what I found out was that they were looking at some of the candidates they'd interviewed before me and seeing who they're interviewing with. And so I became an unfortunate byproduct of central tendency, where I was being compared to these like 3 or 4 other people, and I wasn't even really being given a shot. And I told the 2 interviewers at the table, I said, you know, I think I'm going to end our conversation here, because I can tell that I'm not a person you might be interested in interviewing for this position. And I thank you for your time, but I'm going to respectfully bow out from your process. And I left. I left an interview in the middle of an interview during TPE on site. And a couple hours later, the director, who's also there of the department, saw me in passing, was like, oh, I thought I saw your name on our list today. And they asked like how'd it go? And I gave them my honest feedback, and they said, that's a shame that you didn't feel welcomed by us. That is not who we are. And I said, I can understand that, but this is the experience that I've had, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be at least 1 or 2 more people that have probably had the same experience. So thank you and good day, and I wish you the best of luck in your own process. And so all of these occur in different ways, shapes, and forms. And the thing about biases is that they can be either implicit or explicit. And most of the times we see more of our implicit biases because we don't even know they're doing them. So especially in an interview setting, being aware of such things is going to be really important. And so, I mean, what do y'all think? I mean, I've talked for a hot minute now on the different types. What do you all think? Have you seen any of these? Have you experienced it yourself? All right, I'm going to keep moving on. So how do we overcome interview bias? You must be asking. If you all could name one way in the chat how you can overcome interview bias, that would be great. Or come off mute and say it.
I think one step would be proper training for individuals involved.
Absolutely. Yes, education and awareness is a good step. Y'all hit it right on the head again. All interviews need to be trained on implicit bias. I've said it multiple times throughout this session, and our colleagues who are on with us today have also mentioned it. Being trained in implicit bias is very important. Use an interview guide. If you don't have an interview guide or you don't know what one looks like, connect with your human resources department and let them help you create something based on the position description that you're using. I mean, at Santa Clara, we have our own divisional HR person that we work with. or sorry, an HR person liaisons with our division. And so anytime we've had questions about position descriptions, interview review, or anything like that, we will always contact Vipasha, because she's just the guru of like understanding our position and like what we do and what we're looking for. And so she can really help us craft what the interview guide may look like. Using standardized questions. We used to be an institution when I first got here to Santa Clara that we'd have like 4 or 5 categories of questions, and then the hope was that as you went around that you asked one question from each category, but then you could feel free to ask other questions, which doesn't really help because you're not able to score a candidate on a question that is not listed. So being able to use standardized questions for everyone is very helpful. Assess candidates on a rubric. If you don't use a rubric for your resume reviews, highly encourage you to use one. It creates a sense of being objective in how you're reviewing materials and how you're understanding candidates' experience and what they do. Rubrics are a great way to make sure everyone is on the same page. Have multiple people interview the candidates. If you're able to, having multiple people interview the candidates to get a different perspective, a different thought, it allows you to, especially as hiring managers, it'll allow you the ability to hear the candidate from multiple perspectives on your campus, or even on like just the interview team through TPE. So having multiple people interview candidates is always a great thing. So that way they can also get exposed to other people within your institution and team. Anticipate candidate follow-up questions, especially in this current age of, or this current time of this, great resignation that's going on. Candidates who are going through TPE are going to have very specific questions on how the institution is navigating flexible work from home policies, how to use sick time, mental health resources for staff and students. And so being able to anticipate some of those questions will also help you as an interviewer be able to coach your teams on how to answer those questions. Because I think it's important that every team, every interview team, whether it's you and one other person or you and like a couple of other people, that y'all know how to answer certain questions. And so that way you're in unison with one another. Because one thing over my years of doing this, and we would hold socials at TP with the schools I've worked at, candidates would say, oh, I asked the same question and this is what I got. And it was like totally different than what we might have expected, but we also never sat down and talked about it. So being able to anticipate some of those follow-up questions and really talk through what that will look like is going to be very important for you as an employer. Don't use your gut. Your gut is a form of bias. I mean, I'm guilty of it. I'll actually talk about it here in a second, but don't just like use your gut. It's one thing to say that you have an intuition or you're intuitive about things, but like, does your intuition match up with the way that you rated the candidate against that scoring rubric? Because you have to go with that. Because if you don't go with the scoring rubric and you just go like, well, I think this person's going to be great because their energy was great. Okay, if that's a decision that you want to make, great, but that's not going to be a great indicator if someone is actually going to be able to do the job effectively and efficiently. Recruit from a variety of spaces. Sorry, it says TPE Virtual 2021, but TPE Virtual is a thing. And so we are excited to see you all, but recruit from a variety of different places. Know where your posting is going. If you don't know where your posts are posted outside of higheredjobs.com, how are you going to be able to attract a quality pool of candidates? And candidate rubrics. So again, the initial candidate review of resumes, creating a job description, you should also create a rubric at the same time. So in our job description, we have 5 areas of different, five core areas of competency within our job description. There should be 5 areas of evaluation review for a resume that is based on the job description. So as you're creating a job description, think about how you would have to score this person on a rubric. Use your HR tools to assist with building candidate rubrics. Your HR managers and HR folks have all these different tools that they can avail to you to give you a jump start on how to create these rubrics. Consult with your institutional HR team to review your rubrics and questions for potential bias. I think that's something that is very underutilized as an HR, as a hiring manager. So we will routinely have our process evaluated before we start, just because we want to ensure that we're able to attract and keep and sell our experience to folks. One thing we do here at SCU is every hiring manager is required to go through inclusive in hiring and recruitment training. And so it talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues within interview hiring. It talks about like our institutional values and how they fit within the HR hiring process, but it just talks about like the ways that you can help reduce bias and create a truly inclusive process where folks will get the best sense of who Santa Clara University is. If your institution doesn't offer this, I definitely think creating something like this in-house is going to be very beneficial to you as a future employer. Interview guide and questions. Create your interview guide with your team. Have templates ready for candidate communications. Questions for each round that are going to be asked. Expectations for folks who are going to be part of the interviews. Create standardized questions. 3 to 5 questions that every candidate should answer in every round. So even if you want the conversation to be a little bit more conversational during a candidate's interview process, like at least have 3 to 5 standard questions that every round of interviewers has to ask. So that way they're just not pulling questions out of the air, because that doesn't give you a true sense if you're only asking certain types of questions. And I guess the question for you all is, in your process, do you send out interview questions ahead of time? There's a no. Oh, that's great, Devin. Yeah, my last institution, we started doing that, just so that way candidates can have a sense of what kinds of questions they could be asked. For the final interview, we don't send the final questions because there's also multiple rounds of people for the final interview, but we also send them like, here are the types of questions you're going to be asked with examples in each. So that way candidates can prepare their own experiences and examples to be ready to go. So if you don't send your questions ahead of time, that's okay. But if you can, prepare that candidate as best as you can by letting them know the types of questions they're going to be asked if you don't want to send the questions ahead of time. At least letting them know, like, you're going to be asked questions about budget. You're going to be asked questions about, if it's an operations role, you're going to be asked about how you work with campus admission partners to help determine occupancy for the next year. So at least giving the candidates a preview of what types of questions will be asked is always good. And it'll cut down on folks saying in an interview process, well, I don't think they really understood our question. It's like, well, I mean, are you asking the right question? Is it worded correctly? And like, is it truly getting to what it is that you want that they're going to be doing in the job? So being able to do that ahead of time is great. Having multiple people interview the candidate, setting clear expectations for interviewers. So if you have 5 questions, making sure that you're telling people that these are the 5 questions you have to ask. There's no deviating, there's no like creating your own. These are the questions you need to ask. Devin said, we found it helps to visually see the questions in addition to hearing them during the interview, allows the candidate to review questions and category questions fall under themselves as they process and answer. Yes, that is always great. The more that you can prepare a candidate, the better you're going to be able to get a sense of whether or not they're going to be able to fulfill the role that you're searching for. So if you don't want to send the questions out to a candidate, you don't have to, but at least giving them a sense of what could be coming would be great, which then goes again into having multiple people interview that candidate. And then make a list of potential follow-up questions from candidates. I think that's really important too, like I said earlier. And in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. And again, don't use your gut. And I'm guilty of saying it too. Someone told me this, that your gut is simply your own biases disguised as intuition, which after I thought about it, I was like, oh, that's very true. Set clear evaluation metrics. So if you're going to give someone a 0, what does a 0 mean? What does a 1? What does a 2 mean? So like laying that out for what it's going to look like. And review and revisit interview questions, interview expectations in the questions as well. It's never a bad thing to review and revisit your process to make sure that you're staying in line with what you're trying to accomplish. So recruit from a variety of spaces. So TPE Virtual 2022 is a great place to recruit for your positions. 94% of employers would recommend TPE to their colleagues. 90% of employers reflected on the diverse and number of candidates as a reasons for attending TPE Virtual. And 83% of candidates report having more confidence in the interview after attending TPE. So again, not only just national exposure for the candidate and you all, but it's also a great way to find the folks that you may not find if you're just doing a geographical search as an employer. Because there may not be as many folks as you think who fit certain qualifications that you're looking for. So virtual interview bias can happen in any interview. Training your team regarding inclusive practices set forth by HR is always the key. Making sure your team is ready to go with the interviews, whether that's snacks or making sure you're reviewing all the questions and the scoring of all the questions. Clear expectations of all campus and external partners assisting with interviews. So if your process works as a faculty member, being very explicit with that faculty member of like, these are the questions that we're asking. There's no deviating from the script. Love our faculty, but sometimes here at Santa Clara, they like to go off script and ask the question in their own way. And we have to gently remind them that we can't score the way that you ask the question because now the intent of the question has changed. And then candidate communications are consistent and often, especially in this virtual setting. Being over communicative is never a bad thing. And we hear it from candidates every year that they feel ghosted by employers. So making sure that your communications are consistent and helpful is going to be really key. So before I move on to the end, are there any questions, thoughts, or other considerations? All right, 30 seconds has elapsed. So some reminders, we're about 3 weeks away from TPE Virtual. Interview scheduling is open. If you haven't done so already, update your standard post to your premium job post for free for your first one. And then some of our virtual dates. So TPE is March 11th to the 16th. So March 11th is our employer connection session. So we will have different roundtable speakers and times for employers to connect with one another. March 14th is our Welcome to TPE 2022 overview day. And then March 15th to the 17th are the actual interview days. So getting your teams ready, this is what our schedule is looking like. It'll go live on our website here in the next few days, but really exciting that we are literally 3 weeks away. I have open office hours. Should you want to connect with me, feel free to go to my open office hours. They are filling up fast. And so you can go to the tiny URL link that's listed here. And again, the slides will also be shared with you as a registered participant. And again, thanks for being here. I wish you all the best of luck for your processes and who you're hiring. This is my reference page for where I got some of my information, and just thanks to my colleagues for contributing their thoughts.